might have been a connection issue, so
Yeah,
we're good.
Okay.
Anyways, I was just saying that the floor is yours, and if you wanted to say anything else about yourself other than what Antonella and I shared, please go ahead and we can get started.
Yes, thank you. I haven't heard what you said, but I will just add that I will talk about something today that it's maybe a little bit more general topic than what I usually work on. I usually work on sentence processing and morphology processing from a more psycholinguistic or neurolinguistic perspective. But today I will talk about language a little bit more and different modalities of language from a more, let's say, general perspective. So I'm not an expert in all of these things that I will be discussing today, but I think they are very interesting to think about.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Bojana.
Okay, so I can start if that's okay. Great. So first, I would like to talk about what modality means when we say language and its modalities, right? When we talk about language, language is a means of communication. But when we talk about modality, what we sometimes forget is that actually language exists in space and time, right? So modality refers to the physical reality of its of the communication system, and that refers to the entire process of communication. So from the one person, if we talk about the spoken language, from one person having the idea of what they want to communicate, what the message is, to the person using speech, articulatory organs or other parts of their body to articulate the message in this way or another, then that message being transmitted, which again has its physical reality, and this is what we call the linguistic signal, to that message being perceived by others, by the other person, and actually understanding what the message was. All this is quite a big and complicated task, both on the person who is articulating and on the person who is perceiving. However, it's all done quite automatically, and it's amazing that our brains can do it. But the important thing here is actually to focus on the physical aspect of the linguistic signal. In this particular example, the linguistic signal is transmitted through sound waves because the language is spoken, right? But in principle, we can distinguish between two broad groups of the language modalities, one being spoken language and the other one being sign language. And each of them works with what they have, right? What that reality, the physical reality of that signal allows them to, right? So the spoken language modality, we also call the vocal auditory modality. Why? Because it's articulated with the vocal tract. This is what we use. It is acoustic, means it's transmitted by sound waves. And it is auditory because it's received and processed by the person who is listening by the auditory systems. This is just to say how many different subsystems are actually included in the process of communication. And we have sciences for all these parts of communication process. We have people who are just studying the vocal tract in its relation to language, of course. We have people who are just studying the acoustics of the sound waves from a physical point of view, and we have people who are studying the reception, the auditory reception. Of course, with spoken language also comes written. That is actually a separate way. So this is kind of why we don't take it as the main, let's say, the main modality of the language, because written language is just a documentation of the spoken language. It is secondary to the spoken language. Written languages didn't exist before the spoken language. We first spoke, then we found a way to communicate it so that it's documented somewhere, to document it so that it's documented somewhere, right? We still have many, many languages in the world that don't have written form, that don't have the written system. So this is why written language, it is a different one. So if we would go back to this graph here, it would be transmitted. It's a spoken language, let's say, transmitted through light waves, because we have visual perception included here. And this makes it a little bit similar to the sign language. Sign language is articulated with hands and arms and the rest of the body too, depends. It is transmitted through light waves, so this is why it's photic, the same way actually as written spoken language. And it is visual, so it's received and processed by the visual system. And this is why, in the same way as written language, written spoken language, this is why when we are studying, for example, in psycholinguistics or neurolinguistics, when we are studying written language comprehension, for example, this is why we have to take into consideration that our visual system is included in this language understanding. So language is not independent on its own. Language in our brain works together with all these other sub-processes that are not exclusive to language, right? Vocal tract is not exclusively used in language. The visual perception system of our brain is not exclusively used to see language, but other things too. So when we talk about investigating these two modalities of the language, we have to take into account that they collaborate and sometimes compete with the other things, other subsystems, other sub-processes that our brain is capable of, because everything is intertwined, right? Now, sign languages are languages. What are sign languages? They are languages like any language, but these in particular use visual manual modality, right? But it is important to remember that sign languages are fully fledged natural languages like English, like any language, with their own grammar and their own lexicon and their own set of rules. So what do we mean by natural? It means that when a language is natural, as opposed to artificial language, which have been made like human artificial languages, such as Esperanto, and nowadays we have also programming languages, which are not natural languages. These are artificial languages, although the term language is used very vaguely. But we think that we define natural languages as the systems of communication that are emerged through an abstract, protracted aging process. We are talking about a long period of time before humans were able to have languages, and then in the evolutionarily younger history of humankind, it also takes time for these languages to establish themselves as systems. This is happening without meticulous planning. So let's say spontaneously. This is why we say that the languages emerge, right? So this is the same for spoken language, and is the same for sign language. That means we have a community of people, and in that community, a system emerges over the generations, right? It's not something that happens within one person's lifetime. But languages, something to be called a language as a system, it emerges and it is acquired from when you are a baby as something, and you don't have to be, you can learn a language like we are learning foreign languages. But when it comes to native languages, we acquire them, we don't learn them, right? So sign language is in this respect the same. There was a community and the sign language developed. It just used a manual modality. So another thing is that sign language is different from body language. or body language refers to non-verbal communication, right? And the reason why we're using language and body language is not really correct, right? It should be actually body communication, probably, and I will talk about the difference between language and communication. When we say body language, we refer to the facial expressions, to the body posture, to gestures, eye movements, touch, and the use of space, how close we get to somebody, how far we get from somebody. And these are all usually the things that happen without they're subconscious, and they usually accompany language. Important thing with the body language is it tells a lot. As we know, there's a whole sub-branch of science that is devoted to studying body language. But on their own, they usually are not enough for communication as we know it today, right? Except for some limited meanings like yes, no, come here, and things like that. There are things that we can communicate in certain contexts, right? We need a very, very specific context, and we need, as we know, this body language, these gestures are very, very culturally dependent, right? But it is not a system. What it means that means that it is to be interpreted very broadly. There is no one-to-one mapping between what exactly each body movement means, and we cannot combine different movements to generate new messages. And this is actually one of the main differences between language and communication. Let me see. Okay, here we go. So language versus communication. There are many things that are communication, but not every communication is language. However, language is a type of communication. The linguists define the communication system to be considered language. And for now, we are only aware of humans as the species who is capable of language, although other species are more than capable of communication. So the way we define human language is that it's a system of symbols. And this is very important. What this means is that these symbols are arbitrary. For example, if I use the word glass, there is nothing in that word, the sound of that word, the shape of that word when you write it, that is transparently reminding you of the concept of the glass. Although languages develop from ideograms and pictograms and actual pictures of the objects, in the development of the language, this was more and more abstracted away. The abstraction was important because we needed to communicate more, and we needed a more efficient system that we can, let's say, boil down to the symbols that we can combine to create more and more new messages, right? So, of course, pictograms are cool, and the first, written language documents are very cool and they look pretty. But and this was important in the language evolution. But we can already see, in the first document, in the Rosetta Stone, we can already see the abstraction away from the pictorial representation, so from illustration of the concept to abstracting away. And of course, we will talk about this later. Sign languages are also symbolic, although we think there is a higher degree of iconicity than in the spoken languages, meaning that sometimes the signs and the gestures used in sign language can have some iconicity, can maybe remind of the concepts that they are describing, but it's abstracted away. So it is not true that the sign language is just trying to gesticulate or to describe with your hands what you're explaining. The signs have their arbitrary meanings, and they can be combined in different ways. right? Another very important definition or the condition for something to be considered a human language is the ability of dislocation. What that means is that we can talk about something that happened in the past or that will happen in the future, or about our wishful thinking, or about our dreams. Whereas for communication, things are boiled down to here and now. That we talk about something, we want to communicate something that refers to this particular moment. I will give an example later. The language also has a specific, is acquired in a specific way. There is this theory of minimal input, whereas it is believed that the babies are capable, because of how our brains are made, are capable of acquiring languages very fast. And when you think about how many things a baby acquires by the time it is, 2, it is amazing that such a complex system is usually, by ages 3, 4, is mostly acquired. And it is believed that there is something about language that makes it special. There is a debate about it, just to say, but this is one stream of, let's say, philosophy. Language can describe very precise thoughts because of this symbolism, and because of the fact that we can describe something that is not here and now. Language has a hierarchical structure. What that means? It means that we have sounds that we combine to create words, that we combine to create sentences, that we combine to create phrases, etc., etc. So there's a hierarchical structure in the language, and that hierarchical structure follows very clear rules. And rules are probably one of the main things about language. It means things are combined in a certain way. There are rules to combine them, and we know from a lot of research that has been done in psychology and in neuroscience, that our brains have these rules stored. And if you don't follow the rules, the brain reacts. This is actually how neuroscience of language and neurolinguistics works. We want to see what happens if we violate a certain rule of language. For example, if we say the computers is very expensive, right? Upon hearing that word is, it should be are, right? The brain will produce a certain kind of modulation in a certain area of the brain at a certain time after hearing the word, more precisely, probably 400 milliseconds afterwards. And we know that these, let's say, the signatures of language processing are based on the fact that language is a system with rules, which communication is not. As I said, another thing is productivity, meaning that we can create anything we want. We can combine the smaller units into bigger units, into bigger units, into bigger units in the way that we want. We can, this is why we have literature, this is how we have all the creative uses of language, and this is why we can say anything we want. Of course, there are some things that people say, I'm missing a word for this, or I'm missing a word for that. And actually that is interesting, because it probably means that in the future, your language will probably develop a word for that concept. It is usually, language is usually following what a certain culture needs, because language is culture-based, right? There's another debate on language relativity and the famous Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is kind of a debate between whether the culture determines the language, or the way we speak determines our culture and how we behave. It's probably a two-way street. But the most basic assumption is that we will have the words for those concepts that are important for us to communicate. And those concepts are determined by where we live, and how we live, right? This is why, the famous example about several words for snow in certain cultures where it snows a lot, several words for white, whereas in the, most of the Western cultures, you have one. So it is interesting to look at languages, to look across the languages to see what is important to encode, not just which words to introduce in the language, so not just lexicon, but also which grammatical features. And we know, for example, that there are some languages that don't mark past in there. The past is simply not important. So there are some languages that are spoken, in quite close cultures, where simply coding the information about the past event, it does not happen. They will either talk about it as if it is happening now, or they will not talk about it. So again, language reflects the cultures. However, the last point here, called the language universals, was an idea coming, from Greenberg, but also mostly popularized by Noam Chomsky, who is now mostly known as a philosopher and activist, but has actually, created modern linguistics as we know it mostly in the 70s, and most notably the generative syntax. And he promoted this idea that all humans, because of how we are, because of how brains are, have something that is called universal grammar. And universal grammar would be this, let's say, system of language universals that is same for all the languages. And there are people who dedicate their research to showing the things that are the same across the languages. For example, every spoken language has something like a vowel, so I, O, and something like a consonant, right? Now, which consonants, which vowels, that differs a lot, et cetera, right? This is just one. This is just one example. So the way we speak is determined by our culture, but it is also determined by the fact that we are all humans. We are the same animal who has more or less the same brain. So why is it so interesting to know that? Well, because when you see languages that developed in different parts of the world, in the cultures, and this is where the universal grammar comes from, when people actually started comparing languages that are completely, apart geographically, when you look at them, without any contact, one language and another, or third or fourth, there are some things that are similar. And this led people, like having a subject and a verb in a sentence, like wanting to express future. So when you boil down language to these, let's say, a more primitive features, there are a lot of things that overlap across the languages, coming from the need to communicate, which maybe seems to be more or less the same for all humans. So it's a combination. Language is a combination of something that is, let's say, that we are born with how we are, with how our brains are, but also the culture where we are brought. And a lot of our cognitive abilities and cognitive system is a combination of the two. Also called this debate is also, the debate comes from the fact some psychologists assign much more weight to the innate, the things that you are born with, and those are called the nativists. And some other psychologists are assigning more weight to what you're exposed to and what you learn as a baby. And the debate is also called nature versus nurture. Both are important. And this is the same with language. So all these things define human language. Communication on another side is much more simple, boils down to here and now, like baby crying because something is wrong with a baby. It wants to eat, something hurts, it is annoyed. So it is creating some kind of signal, sending signal to say that something is wrong. And then you have to decode exactly what's wrong, right? then the bees are very well known. Talking about other species with systems of communication, bees are very well known for having a greatly developed system of communication. The way they fly, so it's called a waggle run, the way they fly is telling to the other bees where there are flowers, where there's food, right? So they fly in a certain shape, and the shape indicates the direction and the distance of the food. So depending on which direction and how they do the waggle, they communicate to the other bees how far and in which direction the food is, right? The dolphins also have a communication system, which we know less about, but this is something that, again, this is what's different from language. What they are communicating is now, there, that. It is very simple. It sends a message that, it's not really precise. You have to infer a lot. But in biology, people who are into biology and a communication system with the other species, I mean, they claim that some of the species have a really complex communication system, but that's beyond my knowledge. So another thing, going back to the sign languages, so this is the reason why I talked about this, is to try to describe what a language is. Sign language, as well as spoken language, has all these features, right? It is not just describing, using gestures to describe something that is happening here and now. So another a myth that is sometimes related to sign languages is that there is only one sign language in the world and that everybody understands everybody. But that comes from the assumption that the sign languages are iconic descriptions of the concepts. That comes from the lack of knowledge that sign languages are also symbolic. So no, they are not mutually understandable. We have American Sign Language, we have Spanish Sign Language. They are separate languages with their own systems of rules. And it usually corresponds to one country, one sign language, but the same as with spoken language, you can have many languages spoken in the same country. The only thing with sign language, it is a little bit different, is because there aren't so many people who are users of sign language. They tend to, let's say, to network and to connect, and that is usually within one society or within one culture, one country. This is why the correspondence between one country, one language is a little bit better with sign languages than spoken languages. Right now, we know of over 200 sign languages that are documented, and we expect that there are many of them that are not documented because they're maybe used in a very small community. The sign language is used by deaf people, hard of hearing people, which is a general term for the different levels of deafness. Also by hearing individuals who have trouble with oral language due to a certain disability. Again, using language requires a big apparatus, which can sometimes, you can have that disability, or hearing individuals with deaf family members. This is also very common. This is how we get, which is a very interesting thing. We have people who are bilinguals, but they are bilingual between a spoken and a sign language, right? Now there's also, and I will use this as a segue to go to the next section of the talk. There's a little bit of, so cochlear implants are the usually the, let's say, the aids that are put for the babies and toddlers that are hard of hearing, and they're meant to stimulate the brain so that the hearing is over the time trained better and they improve their hearing. And then at some point there was a little bit of a misconception that a cochlear implant means that the baby will be as a completely hearing individual, right? Which is not the case. And I just wanted here to mention that right now what we know is that the studies show that whenever you have a hard of hearing child, you should teach the child the sign language, because the studies show, because sign language is a normal language, just using a different modality, right? And the baby will have the language development steps and will develop a fully fledged sign language as with a spoken language. Whereas if you limit a baby to with a cochlear implant, which means that baby is not a completely a hearing individual, if you limit that baby only to the spoken language, those children have a lot of problem and are hindered and are late with their language acquisition, right? So this is just to say that, but there is this, let's say, opinion about the sign language that it's not a language enough, but it's a full system, right? So parents with the babies that are hard of hearing, sometimes, it also comes from the lack of information and the fact that research on sign language is really, is just now being, done. So we didn't know a lot until recently, but now we know that actually it's, if you can teach your baby a sign language, do it. Like, the more languages, the better is always the solution. But this brings me to the story about the sign language development in babies, and these slides, a colleague of mine, Saul Villamariel, who works on sign language, who's a sign language interpreter, he helped me with these. He kindly provided some of these slides. So the acquisition of the spoken language and the acquisition of the sign language correspond. That means that we have, yes, we had a question, right?
Oh, yes. Yes, thank you, Bojana. I was just, since you were segmenting, it seems like, to the next part, I just wanted to comment something and let our students have an opportunity in case they wanted to have a question to raise their hands.
Sure.
Just in general, very interesting. I think, even if it's sign language, it's almost like learning a second language. So whether it's English or Spanish or another language, it helps in the development of brain pathways and things.
Exactly.
What do you think? Just two quick comments. I don't know if we'll get off topic or not. Maybe you have a short response. For languages overall, are they shrinking globally? Like, we used to have more languages and some are disappearing, or are they being created just as fast as they're being destroyed? And then the other question is about the power of words, as far as like, positive words, in your research, not speculation or hearsay, but in actual research, the power of words, how has that had an impact in psychology and mentality, whether they be positive or negative? Is there strong evidence linking those things together, or what can you share about that?
We definitely have evidence that positive and negatively, we call that the connotation, that the connotation of the words affects, that they're differently processed in the brain, definitely. So I don't know whether you asked it in the context of development or not. The important thing is that I believe that I sometimes think of swear words that are, a taboo and are, let's say, forbidden, but I strongly believe that they have their place in the language. So the idea is to, there are things that we cannot communicate without the swear words, some kind of emotion. So I think it also comes with the negative and positive. I think there has to be a, the context that is appropriate for it. Now, in terms of, it's all like a range of what language is, so both the negative and the positive things. Now, another thing is that what a negative and positive is also is very individual. So it is very hard for us to understand. We add our own connotations to the words based on our personal experience. So when people want to, investigate how positive or negative concepts are being processed, they have to take something really strong, like a war or death or things like that, right? So we are very limited. But it's definitely that if something is, it's definite that if something is painful or let's say has a very strong connotation, that we will react to it a little bit more. It all with the brain, it all boils down to a surprise, basically. So yeah, that's it. And
Perfect.
about and what was the first question?
The other
Sorry?
one was if the languages are being created as fast as they're being destroyed, or we're losing languages or gaining them.
That's a very good question. But the problem with that is that you don't know until a couple of 100 years pass, So right now, I think that in general, we could say that, the globalization is probably affecting some smaller languages. That the languages are being, maybe some of their modalities, but then depending on the country, there's something called language policy, and we have languages that are being reborn because of a good language policy. So I think I don't know. I would say that intuitively we will probably see that we are losing some languages, but at the same time, as we know more and more about the languages, we can do more to protect them. So I think that at the end, it's a normal. We have no idea how many languages were lost. Like in the last couple of thousands of years, we don't know.
That's right. At least I think now any languages that exist, we can actually document them and they can be saved in perpetuity. But the ones that are lost, that's it, they're gone. But
that's it. We don't know about it. So that's it. So
we
at
have
the
all the
same
technology.
time, exactly, we have this globalization that is kind of let's say, but we always had this dominant culture. There was always a dominant culture. It's just now it's more than ever that there is a language that is so dominant.
And then there was also an issue where an artificial intelligence seemed to have created its own language, and then the researchers couldn't understand what it was saying to itself. Because it had developed its own language.
So, I am not sure whether that's true. I don't buy it completely. I still don't think that. I think what they found is that it has a very limited. When I was talking about productivity, because the artificial intelligence is based on huge data sets, databases. So it's drawing information from what's already there and combining it and recombining it. Now, whether they came up with their own rules, I'm not sure. I just think that they're still not creative. That's the thing. The productivity feature might be missing, although we might get there in a couple of years with the development.
Thank you so much for that, and we'll get back to your presentation. Unless I see some hands up, you can feel free to call upon them through, whenever is appropriate for you.
Sure. Okay. Let me then go on with the language development. I just wanted to say, as I said here, so the babies of the sign language, they're acquiring sign language, have the same milestones. So when we talk about language acquisition with spoken language, it happens differently for different babies, but to, let's say, check if everything is fine, there are certain milestones that are being reached in certain periods. We know that by the time the baby is, let's say, a year and a half or two, the baby should have done this, and that, right? Combine two words, for example. That baby should have started producing vowels by the 6th month, stuff like that. So it's the same for the signing babies. And the errors they make are similar. So this is very also interesting. And it's also interesting that sometimes deaf babies also produce some vocal babbles, right? But the same way as the spoken language babies might produce some gesture that might be a manual babble. So it's more like let's say the baby's brain developing and trying things out. But the acquisition order follows the order of the spoken language, right? We go from the least complicated and hard to articulate to the most complicated and hard to articulate. When you think of babies, things like R L and sounds like that, because they are very articulatory difficult, they're acquired later, and some kids have problems with it, and some people never acquire them if you have them in your language. But what comes first are easy things, a, e, and things like t, k, these things that are just obstruction, easy to make. So we have the same thing with the babies. What they first acquire is the location, right? Because every sign has several features, and each features, we call it the phonology of sign language. Each of each features has their own meaning. So we have the location, right, where the sign is made. Depending on the language, this and this might mean a different thing. It might signify, for example, that it happened in the past. Then the movement, because it is informative how you move the hand or the arm. It can mean, for example, from me to you, or from you to me. So we can express the relations, but sometimes it can be something completely non-transparent. So this is when I was talking about symbolism, you know, this can mean he gave something to him, right? If we do it like this, depending on the language. And then the babies, the last thing they acquire is the handshake, because that's the hardest, right? To move their fingers, right? Which is also very important. So we can see how they're going from simpler to more complicated, same as spoken languages. Now, we also have something that is called child-directed signing. In spoken languages, we called it the child-directed speech. And it is the way in which we speak to the babies with a very high-pitched, slowing down, basically yelling at them, and with a lot of repetitions, right? And actually, I know that some parents wonder whether they should talk to their children as if they were adults, but actually there are studies that show that this child-directed speech, this exaggerated and accentuated speech, helps them acquire language, because we really pronounce nicely. There's a lot of emotional content in that prosody that child-directed speech has. So it's not a bad thing if you talk to your child as if it's a child. It is a child in the end. And they have the same thing in signing. So when signing parents sign to their children, they do it slowly, repeat, they make it larger, they try to make a really clear sign with their fingers. So that's another similar thing, and this helps signing children acquire. And the last thing I wanted to say, it has to do with language in the brain. I think the last time, I don't know who was there, but we were talking about the language areas and the language network in the brain. When the neuroscience as a science was just starting, we only knew about a couple of areas, and we thought that the language processing in the language, let's say, where language lives in our brain is limited to those several brain areas. The most famous one is this Broca's area. And the way which was found that Broca's area is actually responsible for speech is that Paul Broca, the scientist, found that that his patient, so he found this posthumously, that his patient that has problems with the speech had this part of the brain actually destroyed with a stroke, right? And it's a so-called Broca's aphasia. Then later we also found that this called Wernicke's, this area, that people who have damage to that area, they have problem not to speak, but to understand language, although they speak nicely. And from then on, scientists started building up the model of what could be the areas of language. Nowadays, we know that this is a very complicated network that we use a lot of parts of the brain that communicate to each other. So we also use not just the surface of the brain, so not just the cortex, but also below the cortex, there are connections, white matter pathways that connect these connect these areas, and damage to any part of the system can cause problems with language. Or not. Brain is a very, very, we call it the brain plasticity. Brain is an organ that adapts a lot, but it depends on a lot of factors, one of them being age. Nevertheless, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, and more generally, this part of the anterior frontal cortex and this temporal cortex, this is all left side of the brain. Left side of the brain is mostly activated during language comprehension, although we use the right one too, but left one is, let's say, the most important one. These are still the language hubs, as we call them. A lot of things related to language, a lot of networks go through these areas, right? So they are very important. And indeed, in language, in spoken language, it was found that Broca's area is being activated while using sign language. Yes, there's a question.
Yes, thank you, Bojana. You mentioned that language is in the whole brain, but a little bit more focused on the left side. I wonder if
much more focused.
I wonder if people who lose their hearing on the right side of the ear have more trouble than people who lose hearing on the left side, because I think they're inversely connected. Is there evidence of that?
I actually don't know about evidence, but it would make complete sense, because this primary auditory area here, it's called Heschel's gyrus, and it's on the left side. And this is where the spoken information goes first. So this is definitely lateralized, yes. Now, that doesn't mean that at some point in your life, if you have a damage to that area, that your brain won't find a way. It really, as I said, it really depends. With this, things such as strokes, it is so hard to draw any conclusions, because no person will have a stroke in a completely same place. So somebody will have a stroke and it will take a huge portion of the secondary auditory area. So maybe that's why, maybe for a patient that only has primary auditory area, the secondary will take over, right? So it is hard, but like the logic is good. Yes.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to confirm that I was talking about like the mechanical hearing, like a problem with the ear canal or the eardrum of transmitting the sound. That's what I was wondering, if, if you lose your hearing on the right side, not because of brain, but because of, an eardrum or some hearing problem, if that is also associated.
I think it would be reprogrammed by probably practice and therapy.
Reprogrammed. Okay. Yeah. Well, we have one more question from Fernando. Fernando, please go ahead.
Good morning.
Morning.
Hello. I am a Latin student. My native language is Spanish. My question is, how improve our brain when I learn two languages or other language? You can talk about this?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and honestly, it's a very fancy hot topic in psycholinguistics right now, how bilingualism or learning new languages improves our brains. And the idea is this, that people, although this is done on people who are native bilinguals, meaning that they have been acquiring more than one language from birth or since they were children, right? The idea is that people who speak or use more than one language daily have practice and thus have better ability of switching from one thing to another, right? Like using their language. And it looks like they're able to somehow transmit those skills of switching, of better monitoring of the situation of what's happening, and something that we call language control, that these three skills, that people who speak more languages, that they're able to transmit this to other things too. But what I would say is that just knowing more than one language is, good thing on its own. So it definitely, in the end, using the brain is making connections between neurons. It's like walking the same path over and over again. So the more you use it, the quicker you will be next time you use it. So I would say that, there are many, many good sides to learning new languages. And it looks like that learning more languages from birth is good for our brains, actually. Do we have another?
Fantastic. We did have another question, but I think you may have answered it because they put their hand down. Okay. So we can continue, and if time allows, we can accept more questions.
Yes, I will only have one slide, so I think we will have more time for questions. Okay. So yes, I was talking about this brain network. Now, it really depends, as we said, going back to, the second slide, talking about language within other systems. So the area for spoken language is very close to the primary motor area, right? And this is generally motor area. So you can see that the speech is very close in our brain to the motor areas, to the other motor areas, right? Because we need to plan to move our the organs that are going to produce the speech, right? So that makes sense. So that means that the speech language, spoken language, communicates and collaborates with motoric system, basically the articulatory system. But then if you look at so when we are planning to say something, this is the first part of the brain that will be activated, and then the information will be sent to the other brain areas, and then to let's say to create a message, because it has to go through the brain area that is for comprehension. But then when we are listening to the language, the information first comes to the primary auditory area, right? And then it's being processed there and then sent to the other language areas through these, as I said, the white matter pathways. When we are looking at a language, such as sign language or reading language, the information from our eyes through the optic nerve goes to the back of the brain first, to the primary visual area. And then from there, the information is sent to the more language-specific centers, right? So we have more language specific and less language specific, and then depending on the modality of the language, these different brain areas will communicate. In the end, the brain is like a machine that is ready for everything at any moment. So it's a communication of a lot of areas. So with the spoken language, as I said, the research has also found the Broca's area to be very important with spoken language understanding. But there are some differences. This is a very, let's say, the finding that hasn't been so replicated because the studies are very young. But it looks like deaf humans might have larger ratio in this Heschel's gyrus that I was mentioning, the primary auditory area. The ratio of white matter and gray matter might be different for them. But again, this is really, we still need to understand what this means. It probably means that the white matter is not used to send information because they are not using it, right? But the primary, so as I said, the Heschel's gyrus is not a primary language area, it's just for hearing, right? But the core language areas still seem to be activated with the sign language too, right? So in general, the core language network seems to be same for different modalities. Although again, the combination and what it collaborates with, what other areas they collaborate with might differ, and that makes complete sense, right? And I would finish here, and we might have some more time for questions. Let me see if there are any questions. Yes.
Okay, so our students have the opportunity here to speak directly with an expert. If you have questions about today's presentation, that would be fantastic. If you have questions in general about speech or linguistics, this might be a great opportunity for you to ask. So we have just a couple of more minutes. Let's see. I think I see some hands up.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. Adeyini. Adeniyi. Hi, how are you?
Hello.
Okay. Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good to see you.
Yeah, sorry, don't mind me with my baby. My questions is none between that other. I just want to confirm if the printout of this presentation is going to be sent to our email.
Yes. Yes, give us a day or so to prepare the recording, and then what we're going to do is we're going to upload it to the Merlin Media Center, which is our, AIU learning platform in the student section. And so you'll be able to search for it there and find the video there. So you can watch it at your time or go over it. So yes.
And I will send the presentation also.
Fantastic. Yes, a lot of students ask us for the presentation, so that would be great. Thank you, Bojana. Agnes, how are you, Agnes? Welcome to the class.
Hi, thank you.
A pleasure.
Sorry, my bandwidth is bad and it's raining here, so it might not accommodate a video.
It's okay.
So my question is, when I joined, I heard Bojana talk about nurture versus nature when it comes to language.
Mhm.
And yeah, there are some thoughts that language is a learned behavior. For some think that, and some think that language is more of a cognitive. It comes from inside. So I
Yeah.
just wanted you to explain more on that.
Yeah. So okay, the nativist view would be that, I mean, it was as in the 50s and 60s, it was as extreme as saying that we have a special, let's say, part of our brain, let's say a brain structure that is only responsible for language, acquiring language, and that we as humans are born and we just need a little bit of input, somebody to talk to us a little bit, and we will acquire a language perfectly, right? But the other debate is that the language is like any kind of learned behavior. So like learning how to eat, like learning how to run, like learning how to do everything. And I mean, there's unfortunately evidence for that, and there are children who have been closed until they are, let's say, 7 or 8, and they never acquired a language because there was nobody to teach them, right? So the argument there would be, if it's innate, if we are born with it, anybody should be able to talk and to learn how to speak without any input, without having the parents who will teach you, etc. Right? I think that nowadays we don't believe that it's only, they call it the language instinct. They even call it the instinct, right? Something as we as humans have. I think that it's definitely, we now know that we need input, and it's not just that you need somebody to speak to you. There is also the emotional part of that and the social part of that, that all together works on us acquiring a language. However, it is still fascinating how fast and effortlessly the children do it. So there is definitely, I mean, I know it's not a great answer, but it is a combination of both. But I would say it's more on the, let's say, nurture side that the science is telling us nowadays.
Excellent. Thank you, Bojana. Yeah, I think there's been cases of feral children,
feral
like more
children.
than one
Yes,
in an island. And in the island, they just maybe do sign languages or grunts to each other, but they never develop a language by
Exactly.
themselves. Okay. Fernando, please join us with your question.
Hello again. Yes, she answered me. I have
Okay.
other questions. It's about other class of communication. For example, the instinct or this class of communication, and smell or pheromone that for example, the women, I think that are more sensitive in this class of communication. How the brain work when this type?
I don't know anything about it, honestly. So I would not even call them a communication. I think those are signals, which is a way different way of communication. But you know, language is a system and it's a cognitive system. I think all these signals are working in a way that is very subconscious and that we don't really understand. And yeah.
It might be communication when you use your perfume, then you're kind of doing it actively.
Yeah. Yes, they even say that, you know, a lot of things are called language, but that might be the communication, yes.
Mojisola, please join us. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. Okay, so Bojana, thank you very much for your time. My question is, you know, this question I want to ask is being a misery, some sort of, and I just want to, you know, crack it. And the question is there a particular technique that an adult can use in learning new language? For example, French or Spanish. So
That's
what
a
would
very
that
practical question on is there a shortcut or something?
Yeah. You know, the only thing that we basically know is that repetition is good, which boils down to the threading the path that I was saying. So the communication is good, and people tend to remember more situationally. So this is why we have a lot of teaching methods developed nowadays, which are basically just being exposed to a language surrounding you, just like being thrown in the context where a new language exists. This is why we know that the language is better learned if you go to a country where the language is spoken and you are surrounded not just by explicitly being told the rules, but you are able to connect and put the language in a bigger context. This is what we know. This is why also the language camps and stuff like that is amazing, especially if you go to a new country, which is especially a challenging situation for our brains. And we have studies with, you know, immigrants who show that. It's not the same learning a language from in your school and going to a country and having to learn the language to be able to survive. To, you know, do daily things. It looks like that is a particular thing, like to have an aim, you know, like it's to have an aim that is not just learning a language, because in the end, language is a means of communication, and there's something about it that, you know, language for the purpose of language seems not to be so motivational as using the language to achieve something else.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
But yeah, I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert in teaching techniques. This is all based on science and neuroscience. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm great.
Fantastic, thank you. And our last question of the day will be from Kelvin Malundu. Kelvin, if you can, please turn on your mic and ask your question, please.
Hello, this is Kelvin. Is able to see me in a video because my network here is very, very poor.
Perfect. We can see you a little bit. You're good. Thank you for joining us.
All right, but I would like to ask because I learned that learning new languages improves the brains. Now, I would like to ask if you could explain a little bit more further to understand how this improvement is being recognized in our daily lives. Thank you.
Great, that's a great question. That's a great question. So actually, the evidence for the fact that more languages improves our brain is limited to experimental setting. So when we would give experiments to people to do some other cognitive tasks, right? Cognitive tasks such as we have this, Stroop task. And so when you have to do something quickly, you have a picture on the screen appearing quickly, and you have to recognize, for example, which object is of different color, right? Or you have words written in different colors, and you have to detect when the word doesn't correspond to the color it is colored in, right? So these quick detection, let's say, monitoring and switching tasks seem to be, so the bilingual seem to be better in these things. Now, it is a very good question what that means in practical terms for our daily life, and we don't have any evidence on that. I mean, maybe we could conclude that maybe we would be better in multitasking, for example, but we don't have evidence for that. We only have evidence for these cognitive tasks, within the lab, that, there is something with switching and monitoring that is simply practiced more with bilinguals. Now, whether that's useful, I don't know.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a very good thing.
Thank you. Okay, you can also send us the PPT so that we are able also to go through for our daily notes.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Fernando, Kelvin, Menchola, Abdullahi, Cliff, and especially Bojana and Antonella. Antonella is our co-host today. We're very happy to have her be part of the live classes as well as a co-host. And Bojana, especially for you, today's presentation to me was very enlightening. It caused a lot of deeper thought on communication, things that you normally don't think of. And thank you for your research and for sharing everything with our students today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure, really.